The Miller residence sat on the periphery of a town that survived on the extraction of timber, a place where the geography was dominated by the crushing weight of the Olympic Peninsula's old-growth forests. In July of 1982, the atmosphere in the valley was thick with the scent of pine resin and the humidity of a lingering heat wave. The house itself was a sturdy, two-story craftsman built by the children's grandfather with the intention of lasting a century. It was a structure of heavy timber and deep foundations designed to withstand the brutal winters of the Pacific Northwest. Inside, the lives of Thomas, Sarah, and Silas Miller were measured in the small, tactile details of a rural childhood: the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the smell of wood smoke, and the precise organization of their shared attic bedroom. On the evening of July 14th, the normalcy was absolute. The children had spent the afternoon helping their father, Arthur, clear brush near the property line. Neighbors would later testify that they saw the children playing near the edge of the woods, Thomas leading the way with a makeshift wooden sword, Sarah trailing with a sketchbook, and little Silas struggling to keep up. There was no sense of dread, no shadowed figure watching from the tree line. They ate a dinner of roast chicken and potatoes, bathed, and were tucked into their beds by 9 p.m. Catherine Miller remembered kissing Silas on the forehead and noticing a small smear of dirt on his cheek that she had missed during the bath. It was the last physical contact any adult would have with them for 44 years. The house was a closed loop. Arthur Miller, a man of meticulous habits due to his profession as a land surveyor, had performed his nightly ritual, checking the deadbolts on the front and back doors, ensuring the windows in the parlor were latched, and testing the handle of the basement door. The attic room where the children slept was accessible only by a narrow staircase that led directly from the primary hallway. There were 2 windows in the room, both 30 feet above the ground, overlooking a steep drop into a rocky ravine. These windows were fitted with heavy, storm-proof screens that were screwed into the frames from the outside. That night, the windows were shut and locked from the interior to keep out the damp night air. The silence that broke the following morning was not a sound, but a lack of it. Usually, the floorboards above the kitchen would creak as the boys wrestled or Sarah moved toward the wardrobe. At 6:30 a.m., the house was unnaturally still. When Catherine ascended the stairs, she found the attic door latched from the inside, a feat the children occasionally performed as a game. She knocked, then called, then pounded. When Arthur finally used a crowbar to force the door, the wood splintered with a violence that contrasted sharply with the stillness inside. The room was empty. The 3 iron beds were slightly ruffled, the indentations of their heads still visible on the pillows. Silas's favorite stuffed bear sat on the rug. The windows remained locked. The screens remained undisturbed. The room was a sterile vault that had somehow leaked its contents. The police response was immediate and initially clinical. Sheriff Miller, no relation, was a man who believed in the physics of crime. He looked for the how before the who. He spent 4 hours in that attic room with a magnifying glass and a flashlight, examining the floorboards for hidden trapdoors and the ceiling for structural breaches. He found nothing. There were no fingerprints on the window latches other than those of the parents. There was no trace of blood, no struggle, no evidence of a sedative. The children's clothes for the next day were folded neatly on the dresser. To the investigators, it was as if the atoms of the 3 siblings had simply ceased to vibrate in unison with the rest of the house. By midday, the institutional trust of the town was activated. The logging companies shut down their saws, and hundreds of men formed a human chain that pushed deep into the surrounding jungle, a terrain of waist-deep ferns, moss-covered logs, and ravines that hadn't seen sunlight in a millennium. They moved with the grim efficiency of people who knew the forest's capacity for swallowing things whole. But even then, there was a logical flaw that haunted the search. If the children had left the house, someone would have seen them. The Miller's dog, an aging retriever with a territorial streak, had slept at the foot of the stairs all night and had not made a sound. The perimeter of the house was dusty from a week without rain. There were no footprints leading away from the foundation. As the sun set on the first day of the search, the investigation began to fracture. The police began to look at the architecture of the family life.
They tore up the floorboards in the parlor. They drained the septic tank. They searched Arthur's surveying equipment, wondering if he had used his knowledge of the local topography to hide his own children in some lightless crevice of the earth. The suspicion was a necessary byproduct of the impossibility of the situation. Because there was no forensic path out of that room, the authorities had to invent a narrative of domestic horror to fill the void. Yet even under the harshest interrogation, the parents remained in a catatonic grief that no actor could simulate. The first part of the Miller mystery ended not with a discovery, but with a chilling realization. As the forensic teams eventually packed their bags and the search parties dwindled, a single piece of physical evidence remained that defied all logic. A month after the disappearance, a local hunter found Sarah's sketchbook sitting on a mossy stump precisely 3 miles into the densest part of the Devil's Punch Bowl, a section of the forest deemed impassable for children. The sketchbook was dry, despite 3 weeks of heavy rain. When opened, the final page contained a drawing of the attic room, dated July 14th. It showed the 3 beds, but the perspective was from the ceiling, looking down on the empty room, as if the artist had been hovering in the air at the moment of their departure. The passage of 44 years in the Olympic Peninsula is a slow, corrosive process. By 2026, the Miller house had long since been reclaimed by the humidity, its cedar siding turning a bruised gray, its foundation choked by invasive blackberries. Arthur and Catherine Miller were gone, having died within years of each other in the late 90s, their hearts failing under the weight of a silence that never broke. The town of Oakhaven had transformed from a logging hub into a fading relic, yet the story of the attic vanishing remained the local ghost story, a warning to children about the hunger of the woods. The case had transitioned from a frantic search into a digital curiosity for true crime archivists, a cold case defined by the absolute absence of a body, a motive, or a trace. The discovery occurred on an unseasonably cold Tuesday in March. A federal biological survey team tasked with mapping the migration patterns of elk in the most inaccessible reaches of the national park was operating in a sector known as the Outer Reach. This was land that had effectively been untouched since the 1920s, a vertical jungle of ancient cedar and hemlock, where the canopy was so dense it created its own microclimate. Using high-resolution LiDAR and ground-penetrating sensors to map the soil composition, the team flagged an anomaly, a structural signature buried deep within a natural sinkhole, miles from any known trail or logging road. When the team descended into the ravine, they expected to find the ruins of a 19th-century trapping cabin or a forgotten mining shaft. What they found instead was a geometric impossibility. Tucked into the roots of a 1,000-year-old tree was a structure of perfectly smooth gray limestone, a material not native to the local geology. It was a small, windowless vault, half swallowed by the earth. There was no door, only a narrow fissure that appeared to have been opened by a recent seismic shift. The air emanating from the fissure was not the scent of damp earth or rot. It was the sterile, recirculated smell of a hospital wing. The lead researcher, a man trained in the clinical detachment of forestry, was the first to shine a light into the darkness. He did not find skeletal remains or the tattered rags of 1980s clothing. Instead, his beam landed on the face of a young boy. The child was sitting on a stone bench, his back against the cold wall. He was wearing a striped pajama top, perfectly pressed, and a pair of blue cotton trousers. He looked as if he had just been tucked in. Beside him sat a girl with a sketchbook in her lap, and a younger boy who appeared to be in a deep, peaceful sleep. The horror that rippled through the survey team was not born of death, but of a terrifying vitality. When the medevac teams and federal investigators arrived under a shroud of absolute secrecy, they confirmed the forensic impossibility. These were Thomas, Sarah, and Silas Miller. They were not skeletons, they were not mummified, they were breathing. Their skin was warm, their pulses were steady, and their faces were identical to the photographs tucked away in the 1982 police files. 44 years had passed in the world outside, but for the Miller children, not a single hour seemed to have aged their cells. Their hair had not grown, their fingernails were trimmed. Even the smear of dirt Catherine had noticed on Silas's cheek on the night of the disappearance was still there, a dark smudge against his youthful skin. It was the last physical contact any adult would have with them for 44 years. The institutional trust was immediately reactivated, but this time it was weaponized. Within hours, the site was cordoned off by a joint task force of federal agents and specialized medical researchers. The children were transported in pressurized pods to a high-security facility, treated not as victims, but as biological anomalies. The public was told that remains had been found to satisfy the local curiosity, but the truth was far more disturbing. As the children were monitored under 24-hour surveillance, the investigators realized a chilling detail. The children were not in a coma. They were in a state of suspended animation so profound that their brain waves showed a flat, rhythmic
chamber revealed trace amounts of hair and skin cells from dozens of other individuals, dating back over a century. The Miller children were not the first. They were simply the only ones recovered while the system was still active. The suffering was reconstructed not through screams, but through the silence of the data. By day 14 of their captivity, the children began to exhibit temporal rejection. Tiny fractures appeared in the crystalline film on their skin. As the barrier failed, the 44 years they had skipped began to exert a physical pressure. Gray hairs appeared on 10-year-old Thomas's head within an hour. Sarah's skin began to lose its elasticity in a matter of minutes. The institution, fearing the loss of its specimens, chose to increase the dosage of the unknown isotope recovered from the vault, effectively attempting to refreeze the children in their state of developmental arrest. They were being tortured by a science that did not understand the soul, held in a state of living decay to satisfy a bureaucratic hunger for the impossible. The investigation into the Miller disappearance eventually led back to a name that had been scrubbed from the local land surveys decades prior: Dr. Alistair Vance. In the late 1940s, Vance had been a consultant for the Department of the Interior, a man whose specialty was not forestry, but geological anomalies and temporal displacement. He was the architect of the Outer Reach Protocols, a series of administrative barriers that designated vast swaths of the Olympic Peninsula as protected wilderness. It was now clear that the protection was not for the trees, but for the things that resided beneath them. The discovery of Vance's private journals, hidden in a humidity-controlled safe within the sub-basement of the Oakhaven Historical Society, revealed a terrifying history of institutional complicity. Vance had discovered the vessels, the limestone vaults, as early as 1938. He didn't view them as threats, but as a resource. His writings detailed a parasitic relationship between the government and the ancient structures. The vaults required anchors, living subjects whose biological signatures could stabilize the temporal field of the limestone. Without these anchors, the isotope production would cease, and the gift of suspended animation, a technology the military desperately wanted for long-term space travel and cryogenic storage, would be lost. The Miller children were not chosen at random. Arthur Miller's career as a land surveyor had been his undoing. He had unknowingly mapped the exact ley lines the government needed to calibrate the vault in the Outer Reach. The vanishing from the locked attic was not a supernatural event, but a highly sophisticated extraction. Documents recovered from the 1982 files, marked with a classification code that bypassed even the FBI, showed that a black site team had been stationed in the crawl space beneath the Miller home for 3 weeks prior to the disappearance. They had used an experimental ultrasonic frequency to vibrate the atoms of the floorboards, creating a localized slip that allowed the children to slide through the solid matter of their bedroom floor into the waiting arms of the state. The system that protected this secret was vast and indifferent. The institutional patterns were visible in the way the search was sabotaged from within. Sheriff Miller's reports had been intercepted and rewritten. The impossible nature of the crime was intentionally leaned into by the authorities to make the parents look guilty and the search look futile. Every time a lead emerged, it was buried under a mountain of bureaucratic red tape. The local logging company that shut down for the search, Its board of directors was chaired by a holding company owned by the same defense contractor funding Vance's research. The town's grief had been a laboratory, and the children were the raw material. Accountability for these actions did not fail by accident. It was designed to be impossible. By the time the children were recovered in 2026, every primary architect of the Outer Reach program was dead. Dr. Vance had died in 1991, taking his specific knowledge of the vessels to a grave marked only by a serial number. The government agencies involved had been reorganized, renamed, and moved through 4 different cabinet departments, creating a paper trail so fragmented that no court could ever assign a single point of blame. The horror reached its peak when the research team at Blackwood attempted to wake the children. They realized that the children were no longer individuals. They had been biologically integrated to the vault's network. When they tried to sever the connection, the children's bodies didn't just age, they began to emit a low-frequency hum that shattered the laboratory's glass. The system was still protecting its assets. The unpunished guilty were not just the men who took them, but the very structures of authority that continued to prioritize the data of their existence over their humanity. The Miller children were kept in a permanent, agonizing transition, never allowed to grow up, never allowed to die, and never allowed to speak of the night they slipped through the floor and into the throat of the earth. The end of the Miller case was not marked by a trial, nor a homecoming, nor a single word of apology from the institutions that had engineered their erasure. By late 2026, the Blackwood Research Station had reached a stalemate with the biology of the 3 siblings. The temporal rejection that had begun when the children were removed from the jungle vault could not be reversed. The more the scientists poked and prodded with modern medicine, the more the children's bodies seemed to react like a failing recording, glitching through decades of cellular growth in a matter of hours, then snapping back into the porcelain-smooth stillness of 1982. They were living paradoxes, and to the federal government, a paradox is a liability. In November, the order was given for Project Terminal Decommissioning. This was the clinical term for the erasure of the evidence. There was no dramatic rescue, there was no whistleblower. The institutional machinery simply decided that the Miller children were no longer worth the risk of public exposure. Under the cover of a simulated power failure at the facility, the children were moved one final time. They were not taken back to the forest, nor were they returned to the empty, rotting house in Oakhaven. They were transported to a black site annex in the high desert, a place where the records are written in disappearing ink and the staff are sworn to a silence that lasts a lifetime. The physical evidence of their existence was systematically purged. The limestone vault in the deep jungle of the Olympic Peninsula was demolished using high-grade thermite, reducing the ancient anomalous stone to a pile of unrecognizable white ash. The sinkhole was filled with concrete and topped with fast-growing invasive species to hide the scar. To any hiker or surveyor who might stumble upon the coordinate in the future, it would look nothing more than a natural depression in the earth. The vessels that Dr. Vance had studied were effectively removed from the geological record, and with them, the proof of the children's 44-year preservation. In Oakhaven, the Miller house was finally demolished by the county. It was cited as a public safety hazard, a blight on the community. As the bulldozers tore through the cedar shingles and the heavy timber frame, the secret of the attic was ground into the dirt. The iron bed frames were sold for scrap. The clothes left in the drawers were burned in a local landfill. The townspeople watched from a distance, feeling a strange sense of relief as the physical reminder of their greatest mystery disappeared. With the house gone, the story lost its anchor. It became a folklore, a campfire tale that lost its teeth with every retelling, until people began to doubt if the Miller children had ever existed at all. There was no justice for Arthur and Catherine Miller, who lay in a neglected plot in the town cemetery, their headstones weathered and unvisited. There was no justice for Thomas, Sarah, and Silas, who remained alive in a strictly technical sense, kept in a permanent chemical sleep in a facility that does not appear on any map. They are the unpunished guilty's greatest achievement, a crime so perfectly integrated into the system that there is no one left to arrest.
The lawyers and generals who signed the orders in 1982 are either dead or living on comfortable pensions, protected by the very laws they manipulated to steal 3 lives. The final philosophical weight of the Miller vanishing is found in the silence that remains. It is a silence that suggests that the world is not built on a foundation of morality, but on a foundation of utility. The children were used as anchors for a technology that was never fully understood, and when the experiment became inconvenient, they were discarded into the margins of history. There is no closure in this understanding. There is only the cold, procedural reality that some things stay buried because the light is too expensive to maintain. The last record of the children is a single graining photograph taken by a low-level technician before the Blackwood facility was scrubbed. It shows Sarah's hand, still small and youthful, clutching a modern pen. On a scrap of sterile medical paper, she had drawn a single image before being sedated for the final transfer. It was not a drawing of her parents or of the house or of the woods. It was a drawing of a clock without hands. Beneath it, in the neat, practiced cursive of an 8-year-old from 1982, she had written a single sentence: "The dark is the same everywhere." The file was closed. The lights in the annex were dimmed. The forest grew back over the concrete. The world moved on, indifferent to the 3 hearts beating in the desert, still waiting for a morning that would never come. The decommissioning of the Miller case should have been the end, a clean erasure facilitated by the sheer weight of the state. But in the architecture of institutional cover-ups, there is a phenomenon known as signal leakage. You can destroy the limestone, you can demolish the Craftsman house, and you can relocate the bodies, but you cannot easily
The moral collapse of the system reached a terminal point when it was discovered that the unpunished guilty, the retired generals and the corporate heads, were being affected by the leak. Thousands of miles away, the men who had signed the orders for the 1982 slip began to suffer from a specific, localized form of dementia. They weren't just losing their memories, they were experiencing perceptual overlap. They would wake up in their modern homes believing they were back in the Miller crawl space, feeling the cold vibration of the ultrasonic equipment against their palms. The children's suffering was finally, after 44 years, finding its way back to the source. The quiet ending of Part 6 is not one of triumph, but of a deepening, inescapable dread. The state realized that they could not kill the children. To stop their hearts would be to trigger a temporal snap that could potentially erase the surrounding 5 miles of geography. The Miller siblings had become a permanent fixture of the American landscape, a living, breathing secret that could never be silenced. They were moved once more, deeper into the earth, into a facility designed to contain nuclear waste. There, in the absolute dark, surrounded by lead and salt, the 3 siblings continued to breathe in unison. Justice was not served. It was merely buried so deep that it became part of the planet's tectonic weight. The children remained 10, 8, and 6, immortal, unaging, and eternally trapped in the moment they were taken, a permanent scar on the face of time. The relocation of the Miller siblings to the Salt Crest Repository in 2028 marked the final transition from human tragedy to geological containment. The facility, carved out of a massive salt dome 2,000 feet beneath the New Mexico desert, was designed to hold the most toxic residues of the atomic age for 10,000 years. It was a place where the concept of human complicity reached its ultimate cold conclusion. The children were no longer treated as patients or even prisoners. They were classified as stable temporal contaminants. They were lowered into the white crystalline silence in lead-lined canisters that mimicked the exact dimensions of the beds they had been stolen from in 1982. However, the master story engine of the universe does not allow for a perfect vacuum. In the world above, the story of the Miller children began to emerge through the most mundane and forensic of channels: real estate records and architectural postmortems. A young investigative historian named Elias Thorne, named perhaps by a cruel twist of fate after the first boy lost at St. Jude's decades prior, began to pull the thread of the Oak Haven demolition. While the state had scrubbed the active files, they had neglected the passive infrastructure. Thorne discovered that the contract for the demolition of the Miller house had been awarded to a shell company with no employees and no equipment. The house hadn't been destroyed, it had been dismantled, piece by piece, and transported to a secret storage site in the Midwest. This was the physical evidence that the institution could not fully erase. Thorne tracked the shipment of the Miller house to a decommissioned Air Force hangar in Ohio. When he breached the facility, he didn't find a pile of debris. He found the house reconstructed inside the hangar, a perfect, hollow shell of the 1982 Craftsman. But it was the renovations that horrified him. The state had stripped the house of its skin, leaving only the skeletal timber and the electrical wiring. They had been trying to re-engineer the slip. In the attic room, the floorboards were replaced with high-conductivity copper plates, and the walls were lined with the same non-native limestone found in the deep jungle vault. The institutional trust was now a weapon used against itself. Thorne leaked the photographs of the reconstructed House of Silence to a network of independent forensic auditors. The public shock was not born of the supernatural, but of the clinical evidence of a 50-year project of human experimentation. The one who vanished was no longer just the children, it was the moral authority of the government. The record showed that the project had consumed billions of dollars in black budget funds, all directed toward maintaining the suspension of 3 small hearts. The goal was never to help them. The goal was to keep the vessel open. As Thorne dug deeper, he found the clinical reconstruction of failure. He discovered that the stasis residue, the crystalline film on the children's skin, was actually a form of biological data storage. The children's bodies were recording the history of the Earth as they moved through the temporal field. Every tremor, every nuclear test, every shift in the magnetic pole was being etched into their cellular structure. They were the ultimate black boxes of the human race. The reason they were found with the same face and the same structure after 44 years was because they were being refreshed by the vault every 24 hours. The jungle vault was not a prison, it was a backup drive. The horror of Part 7 lies in the realization of logical failure. The architects of the Silence realized too late that by placing the children in the salt dome, they had plugged them into the Earth's largest natural resonator. The salt began to vibrate with the children's heartbeats. In Oak Haven, 2,000 miles away, the ground where the house once stood began to hum. The quietude of the valley was broken by a low-frequency thrum that made the teeth of the residents ache. The children were gone, but their absence had become a physical weight that the town could no longer bear. The part ends with Thorne sitting in the dark of the Ohio hangar, looking at the reconstructed attic. He realized that the anomaly was never the disappearance. The anomaly was the belief that anything taken could ever truly be gone. He found a final piece of evidence tucked into the joists of the attic floor, a small wooden sword, identical to the one that Thomas had been playing with on the last day. It was vibrating, not because of a motor, but because it was still anchored to a boy who was currently sleeping in a salt tomb 2,000 feet below the desert. The state had tried to bury the truth, but they had only succeeded in turning the entire planet into a sounding board for a cry that would never be heard. By the winter of 2029, the Salt Crest Repository had ceased to be a passive storage site and become a source of institutional panic. The Salt Dome, a geological formation that had remained stable for over 200 million years, was beginning to undergo a structural metamorphosis. The stability protocols established by the Department of Energy were being overridden by a phenomenon that the lead geologists could only describe as biological harmonic entrainment. The three siblings, specimens 1, 2, and 3, were no longer just occupying space within the lead canisters. Their synchronized life signs were beginning to dictate the vibration of the salt crystals themselves. The forensic detail of the facility's failure was documented in a series of frantic classified status reports. The salt, which should have been a dead, inert mineral, began to glow with a soft bioluminescent pulse. Sensors deep within the dome recorded a rhythmic breath that echoed through the ventilation shafts. The air in the lower levels of the repository became saturated with the same unknown isotope found in the jungle vault, creating a pocket of slow time where a second for the researchers felt like an hour to the clocks on the surface. The children's hearts, still beating at the rate of a sleeping child in 1982, had become the metronome for a subterranean world. The human complicity of the current staff reached a breaking point. The technicians, many of whom were high-level physicists with no knowledge of the 1982 extraction, began to experience memory bleed, similar to the guards in the desert annex. However, because of the crystalline structure of the salt, the effect was magnified. They weren't just smelling wood smoke or hearing 80s TV. They were seeing temporal echoes. A technician would turn a corner in a sterile white corridor and see a 10-year-old Thomas Miller standing in the shadows, holding a wooden sword. When they approached, the figure would dissolve into a cloud of salt dust. The facility was no longer containing a secret, it was projecting a haunting. In the world above, the investigative historian Elias Thorne continued to dismantle the institutional patterns of the cover-up. He discovered that the unpunished guilty, the few remaining architects of the project, were attempting a final, desperate move. They were no longer trying to study the children, they were trying to sever the anchor. They realized that as long as the children remained in a state of suspended animation, the vessel remained open, and the past would continue to leak into the present. The order was given for biological neutralization. They were going to stop the hearts that had been beating for 75 years, 44 in the vault, and the subsequent years in captivity. This was the logical failure that defined the moral collapse of the program. To kill the children was to risk a temporal snap of unknown proportions, yet to keep them alive was to lose control of the physical environment. The state chose the path of destruction. A neutralization team was dispatched to the Saltcrest repository with a specialized chemical agent.
Were being pulled together by the children's biological tether. The Earth was attempting to correct the theft of the siblings by folding space-time to bring them back to their original point of discovery. The human complicity reached its endgame as the remaining unpunished guilty attempted one last act of self-preservation. They authorized Operation Clean Sweep, the total destruction of all digital and physical records pertaining to the 1982 extraction. They burned the original ledgers from Oakhaven, deleted the surveillance footage from the Blackwood station, and attempted to liquidate the historians and analysts who had tracked the signal. But they were fighting a war against a ghost that had already won. The delayed discovery was no longer in the documents, it was in the atmosphere. Every person within a 100-mile radius of the Salt Dome began to experience shared nostalgia, waking up with the vivid, tactile memories of a 1982 childhood they had never lived. They remembered the smell of Catherine Miller's roast chicken. They remembered the weight of Thomas's wooden sword. The clinical reconstruction of suffering was now a public experience. The children's trauma was being broadcast into the collective unconscious of the population. People wept for children they had never met, mourning a loss that had occurred before many of them were born. The institution's ability to protect itself first was neutralized because the secret was no longer a secret, it was a feeling. The government's authority dissolved as the population realized that the stability promised by the state was built on the back of 3 frozen children. The quiet horror of Part 9 culminated in the final visual.
At the Saltcrest repository, the lead-lined canisters began to vibrate with such intensity that the salt crystals around them shattered into a fine white powder. The crystalline film on the children's skin, the stasis residue, began to expand, filling the room with a glowing, translucent fog. Inside the fog, the researchers saw the children finally move. Not with the frantic energy of the living, but with the slow, agonizing grace of statues coming to life. Thomas opened his eyes, and instead of pupils, there were reflections of the 1982 sky. The part ends with a system failure. The power in the facility died, not because of a malfunction, but because the children were drawing the electricity directly from the grid to power their own temporal snap. The last image recorded by the facility's backup cameras was the three siblings stepping out of their canisters, their feet touching the salt floor. They were still 10, 8, and 6 years old, but their shadows on the wall were those of ancient, towering figures. The record was gone. The state was silent. The children were awake.